Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of Books and Bytes. Today, we're diving into a book that's really made waves. It's Antifragile by Nassim Nicholas Taleb. Ever heard the saying, "What doesn't kill you makes you stronger"? Well, this book kind of takes that idea and runs with it.
It does, yeah. It goes way beyond just bouncing back from setbacks.
Yeah.
Taleb introduces this whole concept of antifragility, where things actually benefit from stressors, disorder, even chaos. I mean, think about it. Some things break under pressure, right? Some things endure, but some things actually get better. That's antifragility in a nutshell.
Yeah, and what I found so fascinating was how he argues that this anti-fragility, it's all around us, from like ancient wisdom to modern markets. It's this hidden force behind what survives and thrives.
It really is, and that's what we're going to be exploring today, how Taleb defines this concept, why it matters in our world today,
Yeah.
and what it might mean for you.
All right, sounds like a plan. So let's start at the very beginning. What is anti-fragile? And how is it different from just being tough or resilient?
Okay, so Taleb sets up this kind of spectrum. On one end, you've got the fragile, like a wine glass. It shatters at the slightest shock. Then you've got the robust, like a rock that can withstand a lot, but ultimately it stays the same. But the anti-fragile, that's like a muscle. It actually grows stronger because of the stress you put on it.
I like that, the muscle analogy. It's much clearer than thinking about, say, a financial system or something abstract like that.
Exactly. And Taleb points out how our language often lacks a word for this anti-fragile quality. It's like we've been missing this crucial concept, even though it shapes so much of our world.
He actually says half of life, the interesting half of life, we don't have a name for, which is a pretty bold statement.
It is,
Yeah.
but it kind of speaks to how we often just focus on preventing things from breaking rather than seeing how they could actually gain from disruption.
Okay, so we've got this spectrum, and we know anti-fragile things improve with stressors. What kind of stressors are we talking about here?
Well, Taleb isn't just talking about any kind of stress. It's about volatility, randomness, errors, all those unpredictable elements that we often try to eliminate, especially in the modern world.
And that's where his critique of modern society comes in, right?
Mhm.
He argues that our obsession with order and predictability is actually making us more fragile.
Exactly. He uses this great contrast in the book, the bustling, chaotic souk. That's a traditional marketplace compared to like a sterile, controlled environment of a modern office building. The souk, with its constant hustle and unexpected turns, is actually more resilient because it's adapted to deal with disorder. While the office building, seeking stability above all, it becomes brittle and vulnerable to anything outside its carefully controlled parameters.
So what you're saying is that by trying to smooth out all the bumps in the road, we're actually making ourselves more susceptible to those bumps when they inevitably do come along.
That's a great way to put it. And this leads to one of the most intriguing and maybe controversial aspects of the book, Taleb's concept of iatrogenics.
Okay, let's unpack that. Iatrogenics usually refers to harm caused by medical treatment, right?
Right, but Taleb kind of expands it to encompass any harm caused by the healer, the intervener, the would-be problem solver. He argues that our attempts to control and manage complex systems often backfire, creating more fragility in the long run.
He even uses the 2008 financial crisis as an example of this, right?
Absolutely. He argues that attempts by central banks, like the Federal Reserve under Alan Greenspan, to smooth out the economic cycle and prevent downturns actually led to a buildup of hidden risks and ultimately contributed to the crash.
So it's almost like the more we try to control things, the less control we actually have. That's a pretty sobering thought.
It is. And it leads to another key theme in the book, the power of randomness and errors. Instead of fearing mistakes and trying to eliminate them, Taleb suggests, we should embrace them as opportunities for learning and growth.
So instead of striving for perfection, we should be aiming for anti-fragility. How does that work?
Well, think about biological evolution for a second. Individual organisms are fragile, they die. But the gene pool as a whole benefits from the variation and adaptation that arises from random mutations and environmental pressures. Even though individuals may perish, the species as a whole evolves and gets stronger.
He also uses the rather stark example of plane crashes, right? As tragic as they are, they ultimately contribute to making the system as a whole safer.
Exactly. Each crash forces a thorough investigation, leading to improvements in aircraft design, pilot training, and air traffic control. The system learns from its mistakes, and that's what makes it anti-fragile in the long run.
It's a powerful concept, but it does raise some ethical questions, doesn't it? I mean, on an individual level, experiencing those stressors and errors, it can be incredibly painful.
Absolutely, and Taleb doesn't shy away from that. He acknowledges the tension between individual and collective interests, but he also points out that those who take risks, those who are willing to experiment and push boundaries, like entrepreneurs, for example, or they often make the system as a whole more anti-fragile, even if they themselves might fail along the way.
So it's about finding that balance between protecting ourselves from harm while also allowing for enough risk and randomness to foster growth and innovation.
That's the challenge, isn't it? And that's where some of Taleb's more practical advice comes in, like his concept of optionality and the barbell strategy.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Let's dive into those next.
Optionality is all about having choices, having different paths available to you. It's like having multiple keys on your keychain. If one door doesn't open, you've got others to try.
Okay, I get that, but how does that relate to anti-fragility?
Well, think about it this way. An anti-fragile system is one that can actually benefit from unexpected events, right? So if you have a lot of options, you're better positioned to take advantage of those unexpected opportunities.
Oh, okay. Taleb tells that fantastic story about Thales, the ancient Greek philosopher, doesn't he? It's one about the olive presses.
Exactly. Thales used his knowledge of weather patterns to secure options on olive presses. He knew a good harvest was likely, but he didn't have to buy the presses outright. So when that harvest did come in, he made a fortune. Because he had the option to use those presses.
It was such a brilliant move. He limited his downside risk while maximizing his potential upside.
That's the essence of optionality. It allows you to benefit from the upside of volatility while limiting the downside.
So how can we cultivate optionality in our own lives?
Well, it starts with recognizing that the future is inherently uncertain. Instead of betting everything on a single predictable outcome, we should try to create more options for ourselves.
So diversify, diversify, diversify.
Yeah.
Isn't that what all the financial advisors tell us?
Diversification is definitely a part of it. But it's not just about spreading your money around. It's about diversifying your skills, your knowledge, your experience.
This reminds me of Taleb's barbell strategy, which is another way to implement anti-fragility. Can you remind us what that is?
The barbell strategy is essentially about playing it safe on one side and taking big risks on the other. It's like having a barbell, right? With a heavy weight on each end and nothing in the middle.
Can you give us like a real-life example? How would someone actually implement the barbell strategy?
Sure. Let's say you're someone who's naturally risk-averse in your career. You have a stable job with steady income that forms one end of your barbell. But on the other end, you might pursue a passion project, start a side hustle, or invest in something speculative.
So you're protecting yourself from catastrophic downside with the stable job, while also leaving yourself open to potentially huge upside with a riskier venture.
Exactly. And this principle can be applied to many areas of life: finances, health, relationships, even personal development.
So instead of trying to find the perfect balance in everything, we should be embracing extremes. That seems counterintuitive.
It's not so much about embracing extremes as it is about recognizing that trying to moderate everything can actually make you more fragile.
Can you explain that a bit further? I'm not sure I follow.
Okay, think about someone who tries to eat a perfectly balanced diet all the time. They might be missing out on the benefits of both feasting and fasting, both of which can have positive effects on the body.
So by trying to stay in the middle ground, they're actually depriving themselves of the potential benefits of those extremes.
Precisely. And this principle applies to many areas of life. By embracing a certain amount of volatility and randomness, we can actually make ourselves stronger and more resilient.
That leads to another interesting concept in the book, the Lindy effect. Can you tell us about that?
The Lindy effect essentially states that the longer something has survived, the longer it's likely to continue surviving.
So the old adage, what's old is new again, actually has some scientific backing.
In a way, yes. It suggests that time acts as a filter, weeding out the fragile and leaving behind what's truly robust and anti-fragile.
So things that have stood the test of time, like certain books, ideas, traditions, even recipes, they're more likely to continue to be relevant and valuable in the future.
Exactly. It's a reminder that we can learn a lot from the past, from those things that have proven their resilience over generations.
And that's something Taleb emphasizes throughout the book, isn't it? He's a big proponent of traditional wisdom and practices.
Absolutely. He contrasts the Lindy, those things that have stood the test of time, with the neomania of modern society, our obsession with the new and the novel.
And he argues that this obsession with novelty can often lead to fragility, because we're constantly chasing after the latest fads and trends, which often turn out to be fleeting and unreliable.
He uses a great example in the book Restaurants. A new, trendy restaurant might be the hottest spot in town for a few months, but a restaurant that's been around for decades, that's more likely to still be serving up delicious meals years from now.
It's a great analogy. It makes you think twice about always going for the newest, shiniest thing.
And it ties back to that idea of optionality. By grounding ourselves in what's proven and enduring, we're creating a more stable base from which to explore new possibilities.
It's like having a solid foundation that allows you to take risks without fear of complete collapse.
Now, one of the most engaging aspects of Antifragile is how Taleb uses these colorful characters to illustrate his points. One of the most memorable is Fat Tony.
Oh yes, Fat Tony. He's like the embodiment of street smarts and practical wisdom. Can you remind our listeners who he is?
So Fat Tony is a fictional character, but he represents a very real type of person, someone who's learned about risk and uncertainty through real-world experience, not from textbooks or theoretical models.
And he's often contrasted with Socrates, who represent the more abstract, philosophical approach to knowledge.
Right, Taleb uses this contrast to highlight the limitations of abstract reasoning when it comes to understanding complex systems.
Tony's always dropping these little nuggets of wisdom, these blunt, often hilarious sayings. That really make you think, do you have a favorite?
One that always sticks with me is, suckers try to win arguments, non-suckers try to win.
That's so Fat Tony. It perfectly captures his focus on practical outcomes
Yeah.
rather than abstract debates.
And it speaks to his understanding of skin in the game, a concept Taleb emphasizes throughout the book.
Right, skin in the game. That's a big one. Can you explain what that means?
Essentially, it means having something to lose, having a stake in the outcome of your decisions. Taleb argues that those who have skin in the game are more likely to make sound judgments because they're directly exposed to the consequences of their actions.
He's very critical of those who make decisions that affect others without having to bear any of the risks themselves.
Absolutely. He calls this the Soviet Harvard delusion, the belief that we can manage and control complex systems from a detached theoretical perspective without any real-world experience or accountability.
He sees this as a major source of fragility in our modern world, doesn't he?
He does. And he argues that one of the keys to building more anti-fragile systems is to ensure that those who make decisions also bear the consequences of those decisions.
So more skin in the game for everyone, not just for those at the bottom of the pyramid.
Exactly. And that leads to some really interesting questions about ethics, fairness, and responsibility, which Taleb explores in the later chapters of the book.
Okay, I'm definitely ready to delve into that. Let's move on to the ethical implications of anti-fragility.
You know, when you really think about it, skin in the game is all about aligning incentives. If you're the one who benefits from a decision, you should also be the one who bears the costs if that decision goes wrong.
It seems like common sense when you put it like that. But in reality, there are so many systems where that's just not the case. Taleb calls this a transfer of fragility.
Exactly. One person or group benefits from taking risks, while another person or group bears the consequences if those risks don't pay off.
It's like a game that's rigged, you know?
It is, and Taleb argues that this kind of asymmetry, it not only leads to unfair outcomes, but it also creates systemic fragility.
Because those taking the risks aren't really being held accountable.
Exactly. If you know you'll be bailed out if things go wrong, you're way more likely to take reckless risks.
So how do we create systems that are more ethically aligned, with this idea of anti-fragility?
Well, Taleb offers a number of suggestions. One is decentralization, spreading power and decision-making across multiple entities, rather than concentrating it in a few powerful hands.
He uses Switzerland as an example, right, of a country with a decentralized political system that's proven quite resilient over the centuries.
Right. Another idea is to encourage more trial and error, more experimentation, rather than trying to control and plan everything from the top down.
So instead of trying to prevent all failures, we should allow for more small failures in order to avoid catastrophic ones.
That's the idea. Think about it like the scientific method. You test a hypothesis. You gather data. You learn from your mistakes. That's how knowledge and progress are made.
It's also how evolution works, right? Through trial and error, natural selection.
Precisely. And Taleb argues that this same principle should apply to everything. Our institutions, our businesses, even our personal lives.
So more tinkering, less top-down control.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Now, in the final part of the book, Taleb gets a bit more philosophical, exploring the implications of anti-fragility for how we think about life, death, and the search for meaning.
Okay, now I'm really curious to hear about this. What kind of insights does he offer?
Well, he challenges the idea that we should strive for a life of perfect stability and comfort. He argues that a certain amount of stress and disorder is actually essential for growth and fulfillment.
So instead of trying to avoid all pain and suffering, we should embrace them as opportunities for learning and growth.
I don't know if he'd say embrace exactly, but he does suggest that we should view challenges and setbacks not as things to be feared, but as opportunities to become stronger.
It's that classic idea of what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. But taken to a more philosophical level.
Exactly. And he even touches on the idea of death, arguing that our awareness of our own mortality can actually make life more meaningful and precious.
Wow, that's getting pretty deep.
It is. And it's a fitting way to conclude a book that challenges us to rethink so many of our assumptions about the world.
So after this deep dive into Antifragile, what are some key takeaways for our listeners? How can they apply these ideas to their own lives?
Well, one of the most important takeaways, I think, is to start thinking about the world in terms of fragility, robustness, and antifragility. When you encounter a system or a situation, ask yourself, how does it respond to stressors? Does it break? Does it stay the same? Or does it actually get stronger?
And once you start seeing the world through that lens, you can start making choices that make you more anti-fragile. Like maybe you decide to diversify your investments, or take on a side project that challenges you, or incorporate some intermittent fasting into your diet.
Exactly. And it's not just about specific actions, it's also about cultivating an attitude of anti-fragility, a willingness to experiment, to learn from your mistakes, and to adapt to whatever life throws your way.
It's about embracing the uncertainty of life and recognizing that it's often in those unpredictable moments that we grow the most.
That's a great way to put it. And ultimately, I think that's what makes Antifragile such a compelling and thought-provoking book. It challenges us to rethink our relationship with risk, uncertainty, and the very nature of existence.
Well said. And if our listeners are interested in diving deeper, we highly recommend checking out the book for themselves. It's full of insightful and often surprising ideas that will stay with you long after you finish the last page.
We hope you enjoyed this deep dive into Antifragile. Join us next time for another episode of Books and Bytes, where we'll unpack another thought-provoking book and explore its implications for your life.